Somewhere in the rural flatlands of Bavaria, between the small towns of Schrobenhausen and Ingolstadt, there is a place that no longer exists. The buildings were torn down. The foundations were buried. The trees grew over where the walls once stood. And yet, for more than 100 years, people have not been able to stop thinking about what happened there. In late March of 1922, 6 people were killed on a remote farm called Hinterkaifeck. They were killed with a mattock, a farm tool, heavy and bladed, and they were found days after the murders had taken place. The cattle had been fed. The stove had been lit. Someone had cooked in the kitchen. Neighbors had come and gone. A young girl had been seen in the window, but everyone inside was already dead. This is not a story that ends with answers. It is a story about what it means to be truly, completely alone, and what can find you in that loneliness. It is a story that investigators have worked on for over a century. A story with over 100 identified suspects and 0 confirmed arrests. It is the story of a family that died in silence while the rest of the world went about its mourning. And it begins, as all the most disturbing things do, with something small. Something that could have been nothing. A set of footprints in the snow that led to the farm and did not lead back out. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead sat roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through fields and woodland. In the German dialect of that region, Hinterkaifeck referred simply to a small settlement behind the village of Kaifeck, a name given to a scattering of buildings so remote that the farm was nearly invisible to the outside world. There was no telephone, no regular postal delivery. The nearest neighbors lived far enough away that the sounds of daily life on that farm, the livestock, the voices, the routine, could go unheard for days at a time. The farm was home to the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber was 63 years old, a patriarch by both authority and temperament. Hard-working, private, known throughout the region more for his stubbornness than for warmth. His wife, Kazilia Gruber, was 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, lived on the farm with her 2 children, 7-year-old Kazilia, named after her grandmother, and the infant Joseph, whose paternity was subject to dark and persistent rumor. The youngest member of the household was the farm's newly hired maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived at Hinterkaifeck just 1 day before she died. She was 44 years old. She had taken the job after the previous maid quit, reportedly because she was frightened. She reportedly told people the farm felt haunted. The year was 1922. Germany was still bleeding from the wound of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the country of land, resources, and dignity. Hyperinflation was eating the economy alive. In cities like Munich, people were hungry and desperate. But in places like Hinterkaifeck, the war's aftermath felt different. Slower, quieter, more like a gradual fading of the world. Isolated farming communities like this one existed at a remove from history, governed more by the seasons and by old social codes than by the turbulence of modern politics. Andreas Gruber was not a well-liked man. He was domineering and short-tempered. There were rumors about him, deeply disturbing ones. His son-in-law, Victoria's husband, had died during the war. Before his death, he had formally accused Andreas of incest with his own daughter Victoria. The accusation was investigated by local authorities, and both Andreas and Victoria were fined and briefly jailed. The infant Joseph, born in 1919, was widely believed by neighbors to be the product of that relationship, though this was never conclusively proven, and both parties denied it until their deaths. Whatever the truth of those accusations, the family closed ranks. They stayed on the farm. They stayed together, and the world outside kept its distance. In early 1922, something began to change at Hinterkaifeck. Andreas Gruber, who was not a man prone to expressing fear or uncertainty, began to tell his neighbors that something was wrong. He told them that he had found a newspaper near the farm, a Munich newspaper, that no one in the household had ordered or purchased. It had simply appeared, lying near the road that led to the property. He did not recognize it. He could not explain where it had come from. He told them he had found a set of keys missing from the house. The keys to the outbuildings, the main structure, gone without explanation. No one admitted to losing them. No one could account for them. Then, one evening, he heard something. Footsteps. Not outside, inside. In the attic above the living quarters. He went up to investigate and found nothing. No one was there. The sounds had stopped, but he had heard them clearly enough that it stayed with him. He spoke about these things to the neighbors and to a blacksmith in the nearby town of Waidhofen. He described it plainly, practically, not as a ghost story, but as a problem he was trying to solve. Someone, he suspected, had been living in the attic of the farmhouse. Someone had been there, among them, without their knowledge. He did not call the police. This is one of the facts that investigators and analysts have returned to again and again in the decades since. Andreas Gruber knew something was wrong. He told people about it. He was not unaware that something had entered the periphery of his life. And yet he did not leave. He did not call for help. He stayed on the farm and he kept working. Why? We cannot know, not with certainty. Some historians have suggested that his nature, his stubbornness, his deep distrust of outside authority, his pride, made it impossible for him to summon help. Others have pointed to the practical realities of rural life in that era, where the idea of involving police over strange noises and a missing newspaper might have felt disproportionate, even embarrassing. Others have offered a darker interpretation, that Gruber, a man who harbored his own secrets, was not in the habit of inviting scrutiny from the outside world. Whatever the reason, he stayed, and whatever was waiting in the dark around the farm continued to wait. The murders took place sometime on the evening of Friday, March 31st, 1922. The exact time has never been established. What investigators were able to reconstruct, painstakingly and imperfectly, is a sequence of events that unfolds in stages. At some point that evening, Andreas Gruber and his wife Casilia, their daughter Victoria, and the young girl Casilia, 7 years old, in the first grade, were led or lured into the farm's barn. The manner in which this happened is unknown. There were no signs of a struggle near the farmhouse entrance, no indication that anyone was dragged or forced violently against their will across the threshold of the barn. The investigators believed the family had gone there willingly, possibly because they had been told to, possibly because they were investigating a noise or problem with the livestock. Inside the barn, they were killed. One by one, each was struck with the mattock, a heavy, pick-like farm implement used for digging and breaking ground. The weapon was later found at the scene. The manner of the killings was methodical. It was not frenzied. Forensic analysis conducted at the time noted that the victims appeared to have been killed in sequence, suggesting they were not killed simultaneously in a moment of chaos, but rather one after another, likely meaning that each successive victim may have been aware, for at least a moment, of what was happening. The young girl, Casilia, had torn out fistfuls of her own hair. Investigators concluded she had not died immediately, that she had survived long enough to be conscious and aware of her surroundings after the attack. This is one of the details that has haunted the case most deeply. After the killings in the barn, the maid Maria Baumgartner and the infant Joseph were killed inside the farmhouse. Joseph, still an infant, was in his cradle. He was killed there. Maria Baumgartner had been on the property for only 1 day. The murders were not discovered for 4 days. This is, perhaps, the most disturbing aspect of the entire case, and there is deep competition for that designation. During those 4 days, neighbors noticed that the farm was quiet. Mail went uncollected. But this was not, in itself, extraordinary. Rural farms in Bavaria in 1922 were accustomed to their own rhythms. It wasn't until Sunday, April 2nd, that neighbors became concerned enough to discuss the farm's silence among themselves. The Gruber family had been expected at Sunday Mass. They did not appear. This was unusual enough to register, but it still took until Tuesday, April 4th, before a group of neighbors and eventually the local police were moved to go to the farm and investigate. What they found cannot be overstated in its horror. The bodies of the 4 family members had been lying in the barn for 4 days. The body of the maid and the infant were found inside the house. But the more immediately disorienting discovery was what surrounded the evidence of death, the evidence of life that had continued on the farm after it. The cattle had been fed and watered, not once, but apparently multiple times over the course of those 4 days. Someone had tended to the animals. Someone had opened the food stores and used them. The stove inside the house had been lit. Food had been prepared. There were remnants of meals. A neighbor later reported that on the days following the murder weekend, she had seen a young girl looking out from one of the farmhouse windows. A girl she assumed was the young Kazilia, still alive, still there. She had been dead since Friday night. The investigators who arrived at the farm on April 4th were confronted with a scene that defied easy interpretation. The physical evidence of the murders pointed unambiguously to violence and death. The domestic evidence, the fed animals, the lit stove, the cooked food, pointed to habitation. Someone had been living in that house after killing its occupants. Someone had slept there, eaten there, tended to the farm's daily maintenance, and then, at some point before Tuesday afternoon, left. There were no footprints leading away from the farm. The snow had melted by the time authorities arrived. The investigation that followed was one of the largest mounted in Bavarian history at that time. Over the course of the next year, more than 100 people were questioned. Investigators traveled across Bavaria and beyond. The skulls of the victims were later sent to a Munich clairvoyant, an act that tells you something about both the desperation of the investigators and the investigative standards of the era, and the clairvoyant's reading produced no useful information. The case remained open. The limitations of the investigation were real and significant. In 1922, forensic science was in its infancy. There was no DNA analysis, no fingerprint database of meaningful scale, no standardized crime scene preservation protocols. The farm was handled by multiple parties before formal investigators arrived. Neighbors had walked through it. Evidence had been moved. The 4 days of post-murder habitation meant that the crime scene had been, in effect, occupied and partially contaminated by the perpetrator before anyone knew it was a crime scene at all. What investigators did manage to establish was fragmentary but suggestive. Whoever killed the Gruber family had done so with a deliberate, methodical efficiency. They had not been surprised into violence. This had been planned, or at the very least executed with a calm and purposeful brutality. They had remained on the property afterward not in panic, but in a kind of strange domestic continuity. They had cared for the animals. They had used the kitchen. This was not the behavior of someone who had committed violence and fled in horror. This was someone who had been prepared. The leading theories over the years have included several suspects who have received sustained attention from investigators and researchers. The previous farmhand, who had left Hinterkaifeck under reportedly acrimonious circumstances, was considered. A drifter or vagrant who had sheltered in the attic, corresponding to the sounds Andreas Gruber had reported hearing, was considered. A man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had a complicated and contested relationship with Victoria Gabriel and who was one of the first to arrive at the farm on April 4th, has been the focus of significant suspicion. Schlittenbauer was one of several men rumored to have fathered the infant Joseph. a rumor he himself had propagated and then denied. He reportedly moved the bodies in the barn, ostensibly to search for Joseph, and was observed by other neighbors to show unusual composure at the scene. None of these theories has ever been proven. None of these individuals was ever charged. The case officially remains unsolved. It is worth pausing to consider the victims as people, not as a tableau of bodies and forensic details, but as human beings who lived full lives in that isolated farmstead and who, in the final days of their existence, moved through a deepening atmosphere of wrongness without fully understanding what was closing around them. Andreas Gruber worked his land with the grim dedication of a man who had always worked and who expected to keep working. Casilia Gruber had lived through decades of rural life in Bavaria, the hardships of poverty, of war, of loss. Victoria Gabriel had endured accusation and public shame, and still she had remained, raising her children on the farm where she had grown up. The young Casilia went to school. She came home. She was, by all accounts, a normal child living a normal child's life in a place that was quieter and more isolated than most children could imagine, but that was, to her, simply home. Maria Baumgartner had spent one day at the farm. One day. She had taken the job despite, according to some accounts, having heard unsettling things about the property. Perhaps she needed the work. Perhaps the warnings seemed like superstition. She arrived. She unpacked. She began her duties. And by the following evening, she was dead. The infant Joseph never had a chance to understand anything at all. These were real people. They ate breakfast and argued about small things and went to bed at night in the way that all people do. And in the evenings of late March 1922, while something waited in the dark at the edges of their property, they did not know what was coming. They went to sleep. They woke up. Andreas told his neighbors about the footprints and the strange newspaper. He was troubled. He was watchful. But he could not see clearly enough to save anyone. What the people of Hinterkaifeck feared in those final weeks was a shadow, an impression, a feeling that something was wrong. What they faced was a reality far more specific and deliberate than any shadow. And the terrible distance between what they sensed and what they could not fully comprehend is perhaps the most human element of this entire story. The farmstead was demolished in 1923. The foundations were leveled. A small memorial was later erected near the site, modest and easily missed. The trees are different now. The landscape has shifted in the way that landscapes do when a century passes over them. But the case file was never closed. Over the decades that followed, researchers, journalists, criminologists, and amateur investigators have returned to the Hinterkaifeck murders with new tools and new approaches. In 2007, a group of criminology students at a German police academy conducted a comprehensive cold case re-examination. They reviewed all available evidence with modern methodological frameworks, constructed behavioral profiles of the most likely perpetrator, and ultimately named Lorenz Schlittenbauer as their primary suspect. But they could not prove it. The evidence was not sufficient to support a prosecution even by historical standards, let alone contemporary ones. The skulls of the victims were recovered in 1993, buried on the farm's former grounds. They had been missing from police archives for years, a detail that speaks to the disorganization and loss that had accumulated around the case over decades. They were reburied with appropriate ceremony. The mattock was never definitively identified. The precise timeline of the murders was never established. The stranger who had walked into the farmstead and not walked back out, whoever that person was never confirmed. There is a version of this story that wants to offer resolution, that wants to point at a name, a motive, a clear line of causation that stretches from the footprints in the snow to the body in the barn, to a specific human being sitting in a room, somewhere making the decision to do what was done. History does not offer that version. What it offers instead is this. Somewhere in rural Bavaria, In the late winter of 1922, a persons decided to end 6 lives. They planned it, or they seized an opportunity. They entered that isolated farm, that small world of a family unto itself, and they dismantled it with a farm tool, and then they stayed. They stayed, and they slept, and they ate, and they fed the animals, and they existed in that house among the dead with a composure that is, 100 years later, still almost impossible to process. And then they left. They walked out into whatever world existed beyond that narrow dirt road, and they were never found. The footprints in the snow led to Hinterkaifeck and did not lead back out. And though the snow melted and the farm was torn down and the century moved on, something about that fact has remained stubbornly, disturbingly present. Perhaps it is this, that the most frightening things are not the ones that come screaming out of the dark. They are the ones that walk in quietly, tend to the livestock, light the stove, and disappear into an ordinary morning, leaving nothing behind but questions and the slow, creeping certainty that some silences contain things we were never meant to understand.